Hi everyone, this is Figmentor again with another long-form Clip Studio Paint tutorial on how to paint a Gothic themed vampire-esque female character portrait. In this tutorial, I will be describing my workflow when doing painterly pieces like the one you see here, starting from composition and concept, preliminary problem solving using line work, painting and applying brushstrokes to the piece, and finally adding post-processing to finalize the entire thing. My workflow is not a standard pipeline. Much of it is adapted from one of Dave Rapose's recent painterly styles. I added things here and there to help beginners who have yet to master anatomy, perspective, composition, and color theory. And I also have more back and forth and tool usage in general. Without further delay, let's get started. The first thing I start doing whenever I'm about to begin creating a piece is to take a look at what the subject is and try to break the subject down into what I understand. It's very difficult to start out with nothing in mind and with a blank white canvas. So I suggest to do some research first, using free tools like Google, Pinterest, and Wikipedia to broaden your knowledge and visual library for the theme or subject. Organize the visual notes in a free tool like PureRef. PureRef is a very neat tool for organizing visual reference, and I highly recommend it. You could alternatively just store them on a separate Clip Studio file for review too. As an example for this piece, I was aiming to paint a vampire-esque lady and add all the Gothic elements I can cram into the piece, but in my research I found out that Gothic elements can actually be either of two things. They could either be Gothic architecture or Gothic fashion. For Gothic architecture, I took some time to identify the elements that define the Gothic style. Then I tried to break them down to structures that I can understand, so I can use them as compositional elements in the piece. So according to my notes, Gothic architecture interiors have the following elements: pointed archways, stained glass windows, high ceilings, ornate designs, flying buttresses, gargoyles. You get the point. We're only interested in the interior parts, so I took notes and references of what I think will be useful to create composition, which would be the pointed arcs, the high ceilings, the ornate columns, and especially the stained glass windows. In my process of thumbnailing, I'm just sweeping away with a soft airbrush to create big sweeping shapes in grayscale first. After studying the elements I want to incorporate, I had already the composition in mind. I had the idea of framing the girl wearing Gothic style clothing in an upshot, showcasing a Gothic style interior, using the stained glass windows as framing elements to draw the viewer's eye towards the face, and using the value and color temperature contrast to draw the audience's eye towards her face and upper torso. Here I'm trying to use a circular stained glass window to frame the character's face. And just with the soft airbrush, painting in grayscale, I start to try and shape out the general ambience and look of the background elements. And at this point, I don't really add much detail. Just simple hints of elements that comprise of the Gothic architecture in the background is enough. That's why I tend to zoom out a lot to check the thumbnail of the piece in general. A good thumbnail can go a long way in terms of composition. At this stage, I can also go ahead and apply color balance and tone correction to adjust the layer's general look and values. I'm just experimenting with the colors at this point, and Clip Studio Paint's correction layers help a lot in this regard. I can keep on working on grayscale and apply colors, change levels very liberally using these tools. Once I'm happy with the rough colored thumbnail background, I can freely use Clip Studio Paint's model to create the pose of the character for framing. Although I know my fair share of anatomy, and I can sketch the subject freehand, I'm using Clip Studio's 3D model to make it so that I have less to worry about in terms of composition, proportion, perspective, and hand positioning, since I will also be focusing on her clothes, her facial expressions, and the line work in general. The 3D mannequin helps me just focus on these and worry less about anatomy. For Gothic fashion, my research process actually made me realize that Gothic fashion has nothing to do with Gothic architecture or the time period where Gothic architecture was prominent. Gothic fashion is actually a culmination of antiquated Victorian or Elizabethan style of wardrobe, marked with dark and mysterious features. Most Victorian style clothing consists of corsets, low shoulder necklines called Bertha collars, elegant dresses, and frilly skirts, to name a few. With the general anatomy in place, I can use it to test out the character silhouette by applying a black clipping layer on top of the mannequin. Constantly checking whether your character silhouette has a good read will ensure that you get a good readable pose for your character. That's why I spend a lot of time with that posable 3D model and the black silhouette. You'll get better and better at drawing general silhouettes and posing as time goes by and as you keep on doing it. But for your first few tries, it's very helpful to be able to go in and have a quick way to do trial and error. Clip Studio Paint's 3D mannequin lets you focus on one thing at a time, and this time it's general silhouette design. You can focus on designing your character silhouette by painting black details and changing the overall shape on a different layer just to experiment. And what's neat about the 3D model is that it's completely non-destructive. You can go in and modify the proportions at any time and still retain the pose you have established. Once I'm happy with the silhouette and the pose, I then start part 3, which is iterating and clarifying the forms. With the mannequin as a guide, I don't simply trace over it, but I also try to add in structure that I know that will be important later on. Also making changes to the structure as I see fit. Although I have a picture of the final piece in my head, it's all still muddy, and I really need to use the line work here to keep on iterating on the forms that I need to see in order to start adding the lighting and base color later. And as you can see here, I changed her face, dress, and hair quite a few times before I was thoroughly satisfied that I had solved all the problems in the forms of the piece. and I repeat the process of clarifying all the little forms as many times as I need to, even as to go and do a very rough painting of the values just to help me better understand the direction of the piece later on. Once I'm thoroughly satisfied that I've already understood all the form, I then move on to the final line work. After I'm thoroughly satisfied with the forms I've established, I lay the final line work that will be the basis for the painting. Some would argue that doing line work is not needed anymore when doing a painterly piece, and they'd be right to some degree. However, I do this part to address three things. One, I use the lines to create edges for the base colors. Two, I use a multiply blending option which will help in color picking shadows for the final brushwork later on. 3. It helps me understand the piece better as I paint the tiny little forms later on. At this stage, I already have plans to add more ornate designs and textures into the fabric of her sleeve and skirt. And here is where I feel that the line work isn't needed anymore because they do not define the form very much, and it will be too small to use as a basis for the fill tool. It's also possible that it could muddy up the rest of the piece if I add more line work for small details. And once I'm done with the final line work, it's off to blocking out the flats and adding some preliminary lighting. Once the line work is done, I begin laying down the color flat layers and on separate layers underneath the final line art layer, which I set to multiply. There's no hard and fast rule here. Just make sure that the layering stack makes sense to you and it makes it easy to paint in the lighting and shadow for each object later on. I for one am particular with the order of the actual stuff in real life. I tend to layer the clothes on top of the skin and other elements like the corset, laces, etc. of the clothes on top of the clothes. After I do the initial flat color layers, I go back and tweak the background in preparation to light the scene. I will need to make the background and subject look like they are in the same scene in order to start adding in the illusion of form via the lighting. I also made sure that the glass she's holding has a semi-translucent base color so that painting on top of it via a clipping mask will make it appear translucent. After all the base colors have been filled, I start adding layers with clipping masks using the built-in macro that Clip Studio has. One clipping folder for each of the base color layers. I then start to select colors and hue value shifts to define the shadows and highlights of each of the elements on the character. I also take some colors from the background as well. For the lighting, I plan to hit her with light from all sides. A warm color from the top, some cool colors behind her and on her sides as well. I keep the forms and lighting in mind when adding the shadow and highlights all across each of the base color layers until I'm satisfied with the forms that have been defined. Not worrying so much about the colors and values at this stage since they're on separate layers and I can adjust them freely if I wish to. I'll then unify and make adjustments using various methods such as adding a soft light layer, over painting and adding color balance correction layers, and some tone correction layers. As I am painting and blending the light and shadow elements, I keep in mind that the light sources that I've established earlier and where it will cast shadows, where the form shadows will lie, as well as various highlights along the edges from where the rim lighting is hitting the character. I also paint some flesh tones over the sleeves to create the illusion that they're semi-transparent, and then I also add warm tones where I think warm tones should be. I also use the soft brush with the soft light layers to add some subtle hue variations across each of the surfaces. Like on some parts of her exposed skin, I'll add some warm colors and also some cooler colors in certain areas. So once I'm happy with the colors, the values, and the lighting in general, it's time to move on to part 6, which is painting and brushwork. Once I'm totally happy with the colors that I'm seeing on the girl on the piece, I will copy everything into a flat new layer and start color picking and using the watercolor brush linked in the description to add the brushwork in areas that need it. My main priority at this point are two things. Number one, adding more detail where I think necessary, and also adding the ornate designs on her clothing. Number 2, try and remove anything remotely indicative of the line work that was there before. What I do here is simply color pick and then use the brush, and it will also automatically blend between the colors. Sometimes I tend to add in another color if necessary. I also tend to go from the most prominent features and shapes to the more nuanced and less noticeable features. This ensures that if I should miss lighting any element, it would be something that's less likely to be noticed. Whenever I'm adding in some detail that's a different material from where it's placed, such as the details on her sleeves and skirt, I would add it to another layer, as it would benefit from being in a new layer since light will behave differently when hitting these surfaces. The process of doing the painting is quite tedious, to be honest, but I find it satisfying and rewarding, and since the colors have almost all already been established, you can just go do the painting while you listen to other tutorials or TED Talks while painting and having not as much worry as when you're lighting the character. Once I've painted the character, I'll move on to the background. Much like the character, I use line work to clarify the forms for the background. Using the symmetry ruler right down the center, I start using shift tapping to create straight lines to sketch out the shapes, keeping in mind the original Gothic design I had in mind. And since we've already established the colors and values for the general walls and windows of the background, I can use it to simply paint like I would do in the painting phase and define the elements of the background even more. I add in the warm interior lighting via the soft airbrush. It's a hint of the very same lighting that affects our character from the top, but it affects the background less because we're establishing that the light is further away from the walls and is closer to our character. At this point, I'm only using the hard and soft airbrushes because I know I want the audience to focus more on the character, and the background will only be here to reinforce the theme and setting. The Gothic stained glass windows can be done by hand, but we'll be using Clip Studio Paint's rulers and transform tools to help us create them faster. I start with the symmetry tool right down the center, then set up some special rulers, parallel lines to be exact. For vertical lines first, then I create the pointed arch, followed by a special parallel lines ruler for horizontal components. Then I hit Ctrl T for a free transform tool and hold down Ctrl to move the handles to create a perspective skew. The original background on the thumbnail is slightly different from what you'll be seeing here because my recording got messed up, and I'll still try my best to show you how I would go about creating the background you see on the thumbnail. The stained glass window is made using the ellipse tool and drawing on a symmetrical radial ruler with 8 radials. Then adding a round border using the very same ellipse tool without the 8-way radial symmetry turned on. Then I apply the same perspective transformation technique as with the other windows. Then fill in some of the colors of the stained glass. Then, after the background has been painted, I move on to part 8, adding post effects and correction layers. Using correction layers, new soft light layers with opacity, I'll try and make the piece pop with more contrast, and color balance will add more consistency to the piece overall. This is when you'll start to see me zoom in and out of the piece more often and pay attention to the piece's overall coherence or consistency. I typically use the following correction layers in this phase. Number 1, color balance on top of everything to make sure that the piece is more consistent with itself. And 2, on various layers such as the background, I'll apply hue, saturation value, and tone and level adjustments to create separation. And that's it. Putting the more important things first and adding in the final touches last. I can say that the piece is done. Thank you for watching. Keep safe and I'll see you again soon.